So I needed to figure out what the hell's going on with this SNAP stuff. So apparently there's a lot happening, and it's happening very quickly because there are a bunch of emergency restraining orders being filed. Either way, grab the documents that were initially filed and the government's response to try to understand what the hell's going on, because latest update was Justice Jackson, who is responsible for the first district court, I believe, for those, she handles emergency appeals. So the government filed an emergency appeal. Effectively, she granted that emergency appeal. From my understanding, it's only 2 pages, but from my understanding, because it effectively has to go through this district court. And in order for it to be decided by the district court, they had to put a stay on the order to pay out. That was my understanding of it. Doesn't make sense to me, but I'm not a legal person, so whatever. Got me curious about, well, what were the original arguments before? So this one, the argument came from the Rhode Island State Council of Churches, and they filed it against Brooke Rollins, who is the Department of Agriculture secretary. Anyway, the lawsuit challenges 2 recent actions by the USDA concerning SNAP, abrupt suspension of SNAP benefits, despite the plaintiff's claim that the appropriated funds are available, and the premature termination of waivers for certain SNAP work requirements in states and areas where there are insufficient jobs. A core factual allegations. The plaintiffs allege that the USDA unlawfully suspended SNAP benefits for 42 million Americans effective November 1st, 2025. On October 10th, the USDA informed states of a potential lapse in appropriations. On October 24th, the agency directed states to hold their November issuance files and officially suspended all November 2025 benefit allotments. The plaintiff's argument, the complaint argues this suspension is illegal because appropriated funds are available. Specifically, Congress appropriated over 124 and maintained that level in 2025, with each bill placing $3 billion in contingency reserve to remain available to carry out program operations. So that's $6 billion that they put into the emergency fund. The complaint also points to other funds available to the USDA and notes that previous administrations, including the Trump and Obama administrations, had affirmed that contingency funds could be used during a shutdown. The USDA's October 24th memo, however, asserted without legal support that these funds were, quote, not available. So we got $6 billion directly for SNAP, and they're saying that previously in shutdowns, the government has been able to kind of shift money around from different other buckets. The complaint also challenges the USDA's sudden termination of the work requirement waivers for able-bodied adults without dependents. Background: SNAP rules limit the able-bodied adults to 3 months of benefits in a 3-year period unless they meet certain work requirements. States could previously obtain a waiver from this time limit for areas with an unemployment rate over 10% or lack of sufficient jobs. In July 25, Congress passed H.R. 1, which eliminated the lack of sufficient jobs justification for new waivers. So I guess they're trying to get rid of that one so that the only requirement is that the unemployment rate has to be over 10%, which, based on how this government is fudging the numbers, yeah, I don't trust it. So they're trying to get rid of that other justification, which is lack of sufficient jobs. But they're saying it only qualifies for new waivers, not pre-existing ones. Okay, October 3rd, 2025, USDA announced it would terminate all existing waivers, not new ones, existing waivers that had been approved under the lack of sufficient jobs criteria, effective November 2nd, 2025. This action affected approximately 20 states, many of which had waivers approved to last well into 2026. The plaintiff's argument, the complaint argues H.R. 1 did not grant the USDA authority to retroactively terminate existing approved waivers. Irreparable harm. 42 million Americans will lose their primary means of purchasing food. Food pantries and social service agencies will be overwhelmed by a surge in demand, forcing them to divert staff and scarce funds from other critical programs like workforce development, legal aid, and youth nonviolence programs. Municipalities will be forced to expend unbudgeted emergency funds and divert public safety and constituent services staff to manage the food crisis. And retailers, which serve low-income communities, stand to lose a devastating portion of their revenue, 40% of sales in this case. Harm from the waiver termination. This action creates a separate crisis for waiver plaintiffs. SNAP recipients in affected areas will be subject to work requirements on an exceptionally compressed time frame in areas known to lack jobs, risking the loss of benefits as early as March 26. Support organizations will be inundated with complex cases straining their resources. This abrupt change will create administrative chaos as states are left without adequate time to update systems, train staff, or properly notify recipients. Plaintiffs bring 5 counts, all alleging violations of the Administrative Procedure Act, APA. USDA failed to provide a reasoned explanation for its decision, failed to consider the enormous harm, ignored the reliant interest of millions of Americans, and abruptly changed its policy on using contingency funds. Congress mandated that assistance shall be furnished to eligible households and appropriated contingency funds to carry out program operations. The USDA's refusal to use these available funds is contrary to law. Defendants have a non-discretionary duty to furnish assistance to eligible households since funds are available. Their failure to do so is agency action unlawfully withheld. The USDA's action is unlawful because statute authorizes the agency to retroactively terminate existing and approved able-body waivers. So, went through the court's order in regards to that. Chief Judge John J. McConnell Jr. This is a very long name. There's a lot of J's. The court granted the TRO. The court cited October 31st, 2025 social media post from the president who stated a desire to fund SNAP if given the appropriate legal direction of the court. The court's order stated, so here's the order, and here's the legal direction from the court. Core ruling. The court's order focused on congressionally appropriated contingency funds for the SNAP program. It found that due to the government shutdown, the use of those contingency funds has now been required to pay citizens their SNAP benefits. The court's two options for the government. The TRO provided the government with two paths for compliance with firm deadlines. Full payment, option 1. The government should, within its discretion, find the additional funds necessary beyond the contingency funds to fully fund SNAP payments. The court suggested funds from Section 32 of the Agricultural Adjustment Act as a possible source, and the full payment must be made by Monday, November 3rd. That's for full payment. This was issued on November 1st, this order. Partial payment. If the government chose not to use its discretion to make full payment, it was required to make partial payment using the total amount of contingency funds. The court ordered that under no circumstances should these partial payments be made later than November 5th. So the latest date they had to make payments and partial payments was November 5th. The government was also ordered to report to the court by noon on Monday, November 3rd, detailing what it would do to comply. So they had to tell them on Monday what they planned to do. The order also enjoined the defendants from terminating the able-bodied adults without dependents waivers before their expiration date. So they couldn't terminate those waivers. The waivers were already in existence, and they had no justification to terminate those waivers. Now, they had until November 5th. So this was Rhode Island filing documents with the district court to enforce their previous TRO. Or in this one, they said, we're either going to enforce it or issue a new one. Oh, the memorandum was filed on November 6th. Yes, and it was filed on November 6th. Okay, an overview of the ruling. The court granted both requests and they issued a new TRO. The court's scathing introduction. The court begins with a sharp rebuke of the defendant's actions. It notes that 42 million Americans rely on SNAP, including 14 million children. The judge states that the government chose delay over relief. So this is a day after the fact. They had to go there on November 3rd to tell them what they were going to do, and then by November 5th, if they were going to do partial payments, that was the latest that they gave them to comply. They didn't comply because this was filed on the 6th. And so the judge states that the government chose delay over relief, an outcome that predictably magnifies harm. The court calls the government's conduct arbitrary and capricious, an obstruction cloaked in administrative formality. The court recounts the events leading to the hearing. Available funds. Congress had appropriated $6 billion in contingency funds for SNAP, and a separate Section 32 fund contained over $23 billion. Now, it costs about $8 to $9 billion to fund SNAP for 1 month. The shutdown and USDA's actions. The government shutdown began October 1st. On October 10th, USDA announced it would use Section 32 to pay for the WIC program. First TRO, October 31st to November 1st. The court held a hearing on October 31st and orally granted the plaintiff's first TRO. The court found the USDA's decision was likely arbitrary and capricious, noting that the first Trump administration had acknowledged in 2019 that contingency funds could be used during the shutdown. Following a social media post from the president asking for appropriate legal direction, the court issued a written order on November 1st. 4. The court's two options. November 1st TRO gave the defendants two choices. So that was full funding to fully fund November benefits by November 3rd. Any decision not to do this could not be arbitrary or capricious. Option 2, partial funding. Use contingency funds for partial payment by November 5th, but only if they expeditiously resolve the administrative and clerical burdens. Okay, so that was the contingency for that one. 5, defendant's choice. Defendants chose option 2 on November 3rd because they had to go to the court November 3rd. They claimed issuing partial payments was massive and novel, involving procedural difficulties that could take a few weeks up to several months. They refused to use Section 32 funds, arguing it would stray from congressional intent and create a $4 billion gap for child nutrition programs. The new motion and political statements. This is November 4th. Plaintiffs filed the current motion to enforce, arguing the weeks to months delay violated the expeditious requirement of the TRO. President Snap then posted on social media, SNAP benefits will be given only when the radical left Democrats open up government and not before. So he's not complying. This is November 4th. Now let's go to November 5th. The funding error. Plaintiffs notified the court that the defendant's plan, the plaintiffs is Rhode Island, for a 50% benefit reduction would only use $3 billion, leaving $1.5 billion in contingency funds unspent. The defendants responded hours later, admitting an error and stating only a 35% reduction was needed. They then had to send revised tables to the states. So they planned for a 50% reduction, but then it got updated to a 35% reduction. I think I want to read this whole thing. I'm going to read that later. I'm just going to do the summary for now. Partial funding decision. The court grants the motion to enforce. The violation of the TRO. The TRO's partial payment option was required no later than November 5th and demanded defendants expeditiously resolve burdens. Failure to comply. The court finds the defendants did neither. As of November 6th, SNAP recipients still had not received their benefits. The defendants' admission of a calculation error on November 5th, which required sending new tables to the states, proves they had not achieved compliance. Rejection of excuses. The court rejects the procedural difficulties excuse, stating the defendants knew about these delays before they chose this option. The court states the defendants defendants chose option 1, they would be prolonging implementation and frustrating the very purpose of the TRO, fully aware that option 2 provided a faster and more practical means of compliance. The court grants the motion for a new TRO, finding the defendant's decision not to provide full funding was arbitrary and capricious on 4 grounds. The court rejects the defendant's claim that the use of Section 32 funds is committed to agency discretion by law and cannot be reviewed. It cites basic presumption of judicial review under the APA, stating the exception is quite narrowly applied. The court has a duty to decide all relevant questions of law and ensure the agency is not acting arbitrarily. 2, the court finds the plaintiffs are likely to win their case, this is Rhode Island, because the decision not to fully fund SNAP was arbitrary and capricious. The agency entirely failed to consider an important aspect of the problem. By choosing the partial payment option, the agency created the procedural difficulties that would cause delays of up to a few weeks to several months, but it never considered the increased harm this would cause recipients. This patently arbitrary and capricious. The agency's actions was based on a legal error. Its claim that Section 32 funds are exclusively for child nutrition programs is false. The law allows for funds to be transferred interchangeably. The defendant's argument is clearly undermined by their own admission that they just used Section 32 funds for the WIC program, which is entirely separate. The agency's reasoning runs counter to the evidence. The claim that using $4 billion would create an unprecedented and significant shortfall for child nutrition programs is implausible. The court notes that even after a $4 billion transfer, $19.35 billion would remain in the Section 32 account, which is enough to fully fund child nutrition through May 2026 and beyond. The court states it defies belief that defendants would prioritize a hypothetical disruption no sooner than May of 2026, if at all, over the very real and immediate risk of children being deprived of their food assistance today. The court finds the agency's stated reason is a pretext for partisan political purposes. The court cites 2 key pieces of evidence. The USDA banner. The pretextual nature is shown by the USDA website banner that the well has run dry and blames Senate Democrats. The court highlights that this banner disappeared from the website after the first TRO was issued. The president's statements. The president first stated it would be his honor to provide funding if given legal direction. However, after the court provided that direction, he stated benefits will only be given when the radical left Democrats open up government and not before. The court states it is not naive to the administration's true motivations and that this unjustifiable partisanship renders the decision arbitrary and capricious. Woo! Okay. So Justice Jackson issued this on a Friday, issued the stay on a Friday. It's an administrative stay. And the reason why is to give the First Circuit Court time to resolve the government's pending motion. And at least according to First Circuit Court, at 6:08 p.m. on November 7th, the First Circuit Court denied the request for administrative stay, but stated it would rule on the stay pending appeal as quickly as possible. And all of this has been moving fast. So all of this has occurred from October 31st up until now. So it's only been about a week. And these cases have been kind of running back and forth. So we're likely getting an answer sometime next week. So she did grant them the administrative stay because it's still inside the First Circuit Court. And the administrative stay will automatically terminate 48 hours after the First Circuit issues its decision. Effectively, Trump is doing what he always does. He's using the legal system to slow things down. Like he did that to the people that he didn't want to pay when he had them do work on any of his buildings. He didn't pay people, or he only paid them partial amounts, and then he used the court to slow down that payment, effectively forcing those people to expend a ton of money to fight him in court or just go home. This is entirely his modus operandi. He's using the government and this appealing shit to delay things. Like, he is doing this on purpose. So in my brain, I'm trying to figure out, well, why can't they just pay the benefits? Because that's what the emergency order stated. But what they've done is they filed an appeal with the First Circuit, not pay, because they don't want to pay, right? And they needed a stay on the TRO, I guess, so they won't be in violation of it. But the First Circuit said, nah, we're not giving you that, son. Anyway, so they went to the Supreme Court and said, hey, we need an administrative stay because we're appealing this decision so we don't have to pay while we go through this appeal. Because all of this seems like it's just legal. It's like a legal ball of yarn and everything's tangled up. But it makes sense, right? They don't want to pay the money, so they're asking for a stay to not pay the money while they go through the appeals process at the First Circuit. And so Justice Jackson granted them that stay only because the First Circuit said that they're going to handle the appeal very quickly. That was the rationale. But again, this is a legal ball of yarn, and it's a legal ball of yarn on purpose.